Hello, my name is Simon Marshall and I'm a poet and a playwright from Derbyshire. My work tends to be about place and belonging and identity, and today we're going to have a look at dialogue, particularly in spoken word and in script writing, and especially around work which is personal and political and what dialogue does to that. So if you grab a pen and some paper, or if you have your computer in front of you, get a Word document open, and we'll have a look together. That'd be great. Okay, so if we have a think first of all about what dialogue actually is, tends to be a conversation, chatting, two or more people, and if you think about the components of it, when you are having a dialogue with someone, you can either be agreeing with them, the two of you are in agreement and the conversation is about something that you have in common. Conflict, disagreement, so that tends to be slightly more interesting off the bat, like when you're walking past and you can hear two people having an argument, you can't help but sort of chime in. Or exploration, so this is more of a curiosity type thing. So if you know that someone knows about a topic and you don't, a conversation in which you're learning. So let's have a think about how those themes could affect a scene or a piece of writing. So, agreement. What if someone wants something more than whoever they're sharing the scene or the conversation with? So what does that do to the dynamics if, even though two people kind of share a common goal, there might be tension between the two of them because one might sort of push the other one aside to get what they want. They might change their mind. Someone doesn't actually seem that convinced. So yeah, have a think about agreement as a theme in conversation and what that could look like. Conflict tends to be how opposed people actually are to each other. So if there's friction, that tends to keep audiences guessing and listening. And then finally, exploration. So this tends to prompt kind of more of a curiosity, and you learn more about characters' feelings and their history. And this can also create tension if, for example, a character who has been keeping quiet on a topic throughout a play finally gets asked by another character, why won't you talk about that? And suddenly there's an exploration there. So those are just some basic rules when we're thinking about dialogue, but now let's think about the form that we're actually writing. So a poem doesn't often have two characters for there to be tension between. Instead, a poem itself can be a conversation or a debate about something. So in a poem or a spoken word piece, the introduction of another voice is often as an aggressor, who the poet might be defending themselves from or people they represent. So I read a really, really lovely article that said that all poems are in conversation with each other, really. So that's a really great way of thinking about what your voice does. It adds to the debate on a topic or on a feeling. Button poetry, which is a collection of slam poems, spoken word poems that are performed live, often in quite a theatrical style. They have a great bank of material, but one that used to be on button poetry was To J.K. Rowling from Cho Chang by Rachel Rostad. Just a little content warning that the original poem does include some swearing and references a racial language as well. That's a really interesting poem in which it engages with the Harry Potter stories, but sort of picks apart some of maybe the weaknesses that were in the writing around Cho Chang, such as how the character is described as Chinese in the books, but Cho and Chang are actually both Korean surnames. So there's a real political undercurrent in that poem about race and being misrepresented, but there's also a beautiful personal moment in it where we find out about maybe Cho Chang's feelings for Harry Potter that don't get explained too much in the book. So a spoken word poem with a voice, with dialogue in it, tends to be about giving voice to those overlooked or left behind. And in activism terms, what we're thinking about is amplifying an underheard voice. So whatever issue is close to you that you might want to write about, or just start thinking about that maybe you hadn't considered too far so far, such as sexism, the environment, racial prejudice, sexuality, disability rights, homelessness. I know right now in lockdown it can be tricky to really appreciate what other people might be going through, but there are a lot of people who might need other people to speak up for them because they are simply having to focus on getting by. So if you begin a piece of writing with the message you're challenging, you have a really strong place to start. In a poem or in a scene, you can take us from a place of ignorance and transport the audience actually from a place of confusion to a place of awareness. And that's what you personally as a writer offer, is your voice and your perspective on things, being able to take characters and indeed the audience on a journey. And if you think about poetry, poetry is always meant to be heard as well. So you can think about your audience even when writing a poem that might just exist in a page of a notebook. So audiences tend to want to see real change characters undergo during that process in the place that you have set the action. So let's have a think about what tools you as a writer have. You have your language. I kind of mean how colourful their vocabulary is, whether they tend to use lots of similes or metaphors, or whether they speak quite plainly. Your use of rhythm, how fast or slow or playful the kind of writing is. Imagery, what we're seeing and what you're journeying us through. So for example, if I tell you not to think about an ocean, you will be thinking about an ocean because your imagination will have jumped onto that image. So think about what your characters might kind of similarly talk about or not want to talk about. And articulation. So by articulation, I mean how well characters express themselves, because it's so rare that actually you say exactly what you mean, which is why monologues are an interesting thing, because how often do you get what you mean to say right exactly in complete sentences? So when you are writing about characters kind of bursting forward their feelings, do think about whether they trip up and what that does to how vulnerable they're feeling. So yeah, that's one of the tools you have. Think about the settings and the context. So that includes the stakes. So settings as in literally where it's happening, context, what is happening around it. So what time period are we in? What has happened just before? Does the audience need a base understanding of something to follow along with what's being talked about? Fab. And finally, when you are talking about characters or protagonists, think about their jobs or backgrounds and what that might do to what's going on as well. So a really good example of context being hugely key is Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman, which began as a book and then was turned into a stage play and now is a TV series, is a really great example of where our attention is magnified because of power dynamics going on. So for example, the racism that we understand every day as people of colour being oppressed by white people is inverted in Noughts and Crosses. So any exchange where a white person is being oppressed immediately sparks our interest because it doesn't match our expectations, and what that raises is really confusing and interesting. So I think that's one of the real successes of that piece, is that it makes us focus on what is happening in the story and what is happening right now in our lives and what needs to be done to change that and promote equality. Okay, so here's a little writing task for you, just to get your brain going a little. So now we know some of the tools that we're going to use, as we've just mentioned, kind of language and imagery and context. Let's think about, in a scene, if we were writing a script, what ingredients may make characters naturally different so that when they do have dialogue, we're interested or kind of want to be involved. Okay, so if you get your pen or paper or Word document and write down age. Write down some examples of differing ages between two characters at the moment. Relationship that they have to each other. Are they related? Are they strangers? Write down a couple of different versions that might bond two people. How familiar they are. How long they've been in that setting together. So even though they're related, are they long lost brothers? Like what's the dynamic between them? Why they are in that situation. Is it in public? Is it private? Will someone else walk in? Do they want someone else to walk in? Are they hiding? Write down a couple of different versions of what that might be. What do they need to do? So is there something that they're being distracted away from? Is there something that they want to tell the other person they want to do? These are all kind of motivational ingredients, and what their biggest worries are. So what fear do they have? And in an activist sense, this could be where the overarching theme starts to emerge. So could it be that all one of your characters is really worried about is ice caps melting and sea levels rising, and this other character isn't taking that seriously or is too distracted by day-to-day things, so they need to try and find a compromise together. Feel free to go back over that list again and again and come up with different versions, so that when we do a bit of scene writing later, you've got lots of potential individuals to draw from, and also just for yourself, so that when you're writing you could be like, well, I haven't written about a grandparent and a granddaughter before, so let's give that a go. Speaking of which, let's go down to an example. So a good way to zoom in on a topic is to start with individuals, and this makes it digestible, and it makes people care, because personal details are really interesting to us, whereas just talking about something in an abstract way is slightly less involving. An example of a time where I had engaged and zoomed in on a theme was with a short play called Island Nation. So that was a piece about a mixed race granddaughter talking to her white grandfather. So there's a huge age gap between them. They do know each other well, but they haven't spoken so much recently. While they're in this situation, she was visiting him, and what do they need to do? She had come to see how he was doing, because they'd had a grief in the family, and she wanted to kind of find out from him how he was feeling. So as well as being a personal story about this grandfather and granddaughter, it also touched on Brexit and the grandfather's opinions on certain communities. And so that could be done because we had personal characters to lead from. So the dialogue revolved around, well, it began with exploration. Thinking back to our agreement, conflict, exploration, ace. What made it ace? So exploration, the opening line was, "You're down, you." And this was set in Derbyshire, and so said in a Derbyshire accent, with their voices being similar. So it's sometimes interesting to think about where your characters are from and what that does to the words that are said, what sounds maybe heavier or lighter, or softer or sharper. So yeah, the opening line, "You're down, you," and that was her seeking to explore something, and the grandfather character ignores her. So that means that when he changes the topic, so that means that when she raises it again, it's already more charged, because we know that she's tried once and it hasn't worked. So maybe her patience is kind of diminished a little, maybe he might be more sensitive. So yeah, they talk for a little bit about other stuff, and then the conflict emerges. "I said you're down, you." "Oh, leave it, Shan." So Trevor, the grandfather, says to Shannon, "Leave it." So he's kind of giving her a warning. They, being a family, arguments sort of behave differently, don't they, than maybe with a friend or with someone that you don't know that well. Allowances tend to be made much quicker, or arguments are allowed to stretch out for a bit longer. So they talk a bit more directly about the problem, but crucially, he doesn't answer the thing that she's raised with him, which is that he's down, he's upset. and she wants to know what she can do. So when we find out that actually her dad has visited him and he's not been very friendly to her dad, that's when she says, he said you were down and I can see that you're down, so thought I might help. So we have kind of the awareness that another character has been involved. She has the knowledge from the scene so far, and now she has something that she wants to do about it. And then an agreement arises between them because he didn't realise that she was sad in her own way too. So they're not actually maybe as lonely as they first thought because they have something in common. And she comes to accept that his baseline is that he's down right now. So it's more about how she can ease that rather than change it absolutely and do it in a way that makes sense to him rather than forcing something upon him. So a good thing to do when you've even written a first draft of something is to think about your scene having a climate, as though it's a little ecosystem. So in that, it's cool at the start because the characters are kind of establishing dynamics. He's not answering her question, he's batting back with different questions. So there's a kind of a coldness and a tension. It becomes slightly more heated as they argue. So if you think about a graph of the temperature of a scene, it's slightly more heated as they argue. It stills a bit as they settle into kind of a rhythm together. Becomes heated again when he gets upset towards the end of the piece. And then by the end it's just warm as they part because they've sort of made amends with each other. So that was a standalone thing. And actually a poem can behave similarly because you tend to start with a feeling, take it on a journey, on a path, and then by the end either return to that feeling with a renewed energy or return to that feeling and be able to close it off in some way. Brilliant. So now we'll move on to doing some writing together. This is one way of creating. I tend to write a bit like piecing a puzzle together, bit by bit, whereas some people plan everything and then fill in the details. There's a comparison that it's like a bird and a worm, and a bird flies above and sees the whole structure, and a worm, on the other hand, goes from leaf to leaf and is like, this is the most beautiful leaf in the world. No, this is the most beautiful leaf in the world, and I'm a worm. But let's try and see it like treasure hunting instead. That sounds better, right? So to get a prompt, to start off our dialogue, our little scene together, I chose the last message that I received. So I encourage you to do the same. It can be a text, it can be a message on a social media. If one that you immediately scroll past jumps to mind, go with that. I'm not going to police it. But the one that I'm chosen was very helpful. That was the kind of the little message. So we now have a way into some dialogue. Someone saying very helpful. So a very basic way to then kind of start an exchange and to establish that there's another character in the room would be to just repeat very helpful with a question mark. Let's try and think a bit bigger than that. You can make it more complex or more interesting by actually making it respond to one of the things that we mentioned earlier. So how to make it ACE. Agreement, conflict, exploration. So if we were in agreement, we might say, we've got very helpful from one character. Well, I thought so, but what we said about agreement was that maybe one person agrees more than the rest. Well, I thought so. In fact, it's changed my life. And then suddenly we've got stakes and expectations. So now we want to know what the context is. What are they talking about? Especially when we've talked about like a political or a personal sort of route to the work. Maybe they've just read a document or a newspaper, an article, seen a programme, or had a piece of advice, and this person is now saying, in fact, it's changed my whole opinion on it. Spiralling back, so that's maybe an agreement version. Conflict. So you've got your text in front of you, your message. what could be the conflict to it? So the conflict to very helpful would be, it didn't help me. Didn't help me one bit. Suddenly there's a tension between these two characters, especially if whatever was helpful came from someone close to one of the characters. For the other to say, nah, it didn't work for me, makes it feel a bit awkward between them. You can play with the awkwardness with a stage direction, a pause. One of the other characters starts, I don't know, making a cup of tea or something because they need something to do. See what you get from your message, a conflict to it, an opposition. Write it down, don't send it as a reply to the message. Exploration, very helpful. How did it help you? Suddenly we want to know how did it help them? It just put everything into perspective for me. So now suddenly we've zoomed in on someone's personal circumstances and we kind of want to know what they might be. So I challenge you to find your message, to lead a reply with one of those, agreement, conflict or exploration, knowing that you can cycle back to it. And then after a little while, I'm going to go with the very helpful, I thought so, in fact it changed my whole life. It might reveal a stage direction which would establish the setting for us. So, very helpful, I thought so, it changed my whole life. I think these two people are in a waiting room together. So they're not super familiar. It's changed my whole life. Oh, right. Another character picks up a magazine. They're in a hairdresser's waiting room together. So they've only got a little bit of time to talk before one of them will go to have their hair cut. Suddenly we have a little dynamic. And we've also got an excuse for a person to leave and maybe a new person to sit down. So we'll see what reveals from that. It might be hard to imagine for you people in the same room right now, but it will give you more freedom in terms of time and space for whatever context you want, if you do keep it quite broad rather than writing about someone in isolation, because hopefully that won't be relevant for too long. Let's think about how we want the climate of the scene to change. Are we building up to a reveal? So in my hairdresser scene, it would be weird for there to be something at the start other than this very helpful. We can't really have a shocking revelation quite yet from that line. Yours might be quite shocking, and that might be quite a nice way to start the dialogue together. Could there be a reveal in the middle? So just before the character goes to get their haircut, do they say, you know what? I'm gonna give my car to you because this article has changed my life. I don't want to keep polluting the planet. You take it. Do they say that they're gonna move? They want to move to the wilderness. They don't want to live in a carbon heavy lifestyle anymore. Do they then leave and someone else appears? What kind of witnesses this moment of revelation, and what would make that climate, like we say, quite hot and tense? Is there going to be a revelation at the very end? Are the characters in the hairdressers when it said a climate emergency has been declared, a flood is coming, or no one is allowed to leave unless they can prove they're carbon neutral? Something like this that makes the stakes really tense and interesting. Suddenly we have a setting, we have two characters. It might be good to go back to the list to think about what the age difference between them might be, why there's suddenly been allowed to be a bit of a tension between them. And you've got your ingredients and your tool to start cooking a little script up. Great, so well done on that. We're now going to have a little look at writing a poem together using a stimulus of activism and protest and a personal take on that. I'm not going to tell you how to write a poem because poetry is a very individual thing, so I feel like you've got to follow your voice with that. But some guidance on this kind of theme would be that spoken word is a bit like inhabiting a character. So, for example, there's a spoken word artist called Kate Tempest who really goes that extra mile in terms of inhabiting the spirit of what she's talking about. She's quite sing-songy in her delivery. Sarah Kay is another amazing poet who does that, where you get sort of transported in what it is they're talking about. So we're going to think about dialogue in a spoken word poem, and it's useful to think about a poem as a conversation, as we've mentioned before, when you are writing. So, when I think activism at the moment, Greta Thunberg really springs to mind. And her life actually has been really theatrical. She's kind of been thrust into the spotlight of the world. So let's do a poem imagined from her perspective. So be careful that you are writing about real people, so try and be fair. So this young girl recently journeyed across an ocean to speak at a conference with world leaders present. She chose to travel by boat because it would have less of an impact on the climate than if she'd flown. So it's quite a brave thing to do. The Atlantic Ocean is notoriously choppy. So yeah, imagine kind of the struggle and the emotional journey that she also went on whilst at sea. She steps off a boat and then a day or so later speaks at the conference. There's a famous clip of her sort of glaring at the President of the United States, who notoriously isn't very respectful of her opinions, and in fact then went on Twitter and said that she is a girl with an anger management problem and ought to be working on that. And in response, Greta Thunberg made the phrase "a girl working on her anger management problem" her Twitter bio. So she owns the feeling, and it's in direct conversation with something that's been said about her, but she's sort of taken back the narrative. So, as we've mentioned, using the words of the aggressor back to them in the dialogue of a poem is a really interesting way to engage with the topic. So if we start with "she has an anger management problem" in quotation marks, we've got a really strong start to this poem. How might she reply? We have a climate management problem. Invert it, kind of turn it on its head. Or, my anger is nothing to do with you. My problems are bigger than that. See what kind of jumps to mind when you're talking directly in response to a line. She has an anger management problem. Think about how she, as a young girl, being spoken to like that by the President of the United States, how she might feel and where that feeling is in her body, where she is when she's writing and what that might do to the writing. So if she's writing on the boat, is there quite a scattered rhythm as the waves sort of break against the side of the ship? If she's now home and is thinking back on it, if she is on Twitter, is it in short sentences, the poem? So see if some of that can creep into what you're writing as well. Really get involved in the locations of your poems and take us through that imagery, that articulation, the rhythm and the language that's being used. So do you want to write it with the vocabulary of a young person, or do you want to write it with Greta Thunberg looking back at her life later on, for example, years and years in the future? So flow with that poem, and think about when it were to be performed. A spoken word performance involves kind of performing it, speaking it. It can be satisfying to add repetition. So even in that little duologue that I mentioned earlier, you're down, you're down, I can see that you're down. And that really carries the message home. So maybe anger management problem becomes the phrase that gets repeated. And know that poems are as long as the feeling lasts. So interpret that however you will, and see where it takes you. Okay, so finally, to wrap up, hopefully you've come away from this with a little toolkit on how to approach building a scene and establishing the start of some dialogue, and also in a poem, a way of structurally engaging with a piece of dialogue and a response in the writing itself. If you have enjoyed this session, I'm doing an hour-long workshop for Derby Theatre on making protest personal. So that's finding your voice in spoken word and script writing for 14 to 25-year-olds, and that's on Friday the 22nd of May. So you can buy tickets online and we'll get to do some writing together. If not, stay safe, stay creative, and I hope to meet some of you in future. All right, take care.